Good evening and welcome. We're so glad that you are here. My name is Pastor Gretchen Pearson, and I serve as Interim Director of the Office of Religious Life. And this evening, Project Dialogue is honored that Ms. Cokie Roberts will offer the keynote address. Project Dialogue is a program based in the Office of Religious Life that seeks to connect classroom learning with larger societal issues. Many thanks to all who have helped bring this event to fruition, including the Project Dialogue Committee, the Office of the Dean of Students, Dr. Mark Bandus, Dr. Pat Helland, Dr. Mark Dahlhaus. Many thanks for support from the Margaret Cunningham Women's Center and Residential Education and Randy Tarkington. Thanks also to Elizabeth Camp, Mike Zimmerman, Princine Lewis, Beth Fortune, and Jean Polisinski, Kay Tyler, Jamie Rykoff, Ellen Shelton, Gerald DeMarco, Vanderbilt Catering and Vanderbilt Creative Services, and to all who have shared assistance. We are so grateful. And now I am privileged to introduce Beth Fortune, the Vice Chancellor for Public Affairs at Vanderbilt University, leading the university's comprehensive communications, marketing, government, and community initiatives, and serving as the chief spokesperson for the university. Ms. Fortune came to Vanderbilt after serving as press secretary to former Tennessee Governor Don Sundquist, a member of the governor's cabinet and the first female gubernatorial press secretary in Tennessee history. Beth Fortune served as the primary spokesperson for the Sundquist administration. She has received numerous awards and is active in the community. Please join me in welcoming Ms. Beth Fortune, who will introduce our keynote speaker for the evening.
Well, thank you, Gretchen, and it is indeed my great honor to introduce our distinguished speaker tonight. Cokie Roberts is a political commentator for ABC News, providing analysis for all network news programming. From 1996 to 2002, she and Sam Donaldson co-anchored the weekly ABC interview program This Week. Ms. Roberts also serves as senior news analyst for National Public Radio. In her more than 40 years in broadcasting, she has won countless awards, including 3 Emmys. She has been inducted into the Broadcasting and Cable Hall of Fame and was cited by the American Women in Radio and Television as one of the 50 greatest women in the history of broadcasting. In addition to her appearances on the airwaves, Ms. Roberts, along with her husband Stephen V. Roberts, writes a weekly column syndicated in newspapers around the country by United Media. The Roberts are also contributing editors to USA Weekend magazine, and together they wrote From This Day Forward, an account of their more than 40-year marriage and other marriages in American history. The book immediately went on to the New York Times bestseller list, following Cokie Roberts' #1 bestseller, We Are Our Mother's Daughters, an account of women's roles and relationships throughout American history. Ms. Roberts' Histories of Women in America's Founding Era, Founding Mothers, published in 2004, and Ladies of Liberty in 2008 also became instant bestsellers. Cokie Roberts holds more than 20 honorary degrees, serves on the board of several nonprofit institutions, and on the President's Commission on Service and Civic Participation. In 2008, the Library of Congress named her a living legend, one of the very few Americans to have obtained that honor. She is the mother of 2 and grandmother of 6, and I hope that you will join me in welcoming Cokie Roberts to the stage.
Well, thank you. What a treat to be with you and on this beautiful day. Nice of you to come inside. I must say, when I discovered that I was at a school where the school newspaper is called The Hustler, I was a little nervous, but then I learned that the teams have been doing very well, and that's a new phenomenon, so that was a good thing. But what I was really sort of struck by was that I'm here in Nashville, which of course is Al Gore's hometown, and I've known Al Gore since the day he was born, and anytime I think about him, I just think of the stories, of course. His own were pretty good. He would always talk about, that he was so boring that his Secret Service code name was Al Gore. But the truth is that because I've known him, all of his life, he loves to tell stories about how the families knew each other and how nice it was that all through growing up, everybody in Washington did know each other. His parents were there, of course, from Tennessee, and my parents, Hale and Lindy Boggs, were from Louisiana. And my mother tells a story, in fact, that when she came to Washington, my father was elected when he was 26, and she was 24. I think about it now, these kids are 24. The health care bill, they keep talking about children up to the age of 26. It was before the war, before World War II, and so you still had to go calling on people. And she says there she was, this kid. Of course, she didn't consider herself a kid. She had 2 kids. But the horn honks outside the door to take her on her first calling, and it was Lady Bird Johnson and Pauline Gore. And so that's how the families had gotten to know each other, and from the beginning. And then when they were on some foreign trip together, when Al was about 5, he went on the trip because there was nobody to leave him with. He was young for his parents, and so he started acting fussy, and my mother picked him up and jollied him and held him on her lap, and there's a sweet picture of that. And he loves to talk about that story. And he told it when he swore her in. He presided over the swearing in when she was appointed as the ambassador to the Vatican, and it's very sweet. But what he doesn't tell is what Paul Harvey would have called the rest of the story, which is that when many decades later, they went to the South Pole together. And by this time, my mother was in Congress, and they were on some fact-finding trip to the South Pole. Don't ask me what. And so they, all along the way, this story was told to me by a Republican member of Congress who was on the trip, because my mother is disgustingly discreet. She does not tell me any good stuff. But they would have to stop. They stopped in Japan, they stopped in Australia, and every place they stopped, the senator insisted on jogging. And he would jog along, and they'd have to disrupt all of their schedules so he could go jog and all of that. I don't think he's done that lately. But so they finally get to Antarctica and go to the actual South Pole, which at that point was there was this big geodesic dome, and you had to climb up all these winding staircases. And my mother was in her 70s at the time, and she went, up the steps at the South Pole the way she'd gone through life, putting one step in front of the other. And she starts hearing behind her all of this gasping and sighing, and this person who just sounds like he's not going to make it at all. And she turns around, and Al is not making it up the steps. He was apparently having some reaction to the altitude. And she turned to him and said, "Al, the first time we went abroad together, I had to carry you. Am I going to have to do it again?" He hates it when you tell that story. But it was a time when everybody did know each other in Washington, and families knew each other. In fact, when Al Gore first went to the United States Senate, it's a cute story he likes to tell, that Senator Byrd was then the Democratic leader, and he's bringing him around, introducing him, and he introduces him to Senator Strom Thurmond, and he says, "Senator, do you know Senator Thurmond?" And Al says, "The first time I met Senator Thurmond, he stepped on my truck," because, he was 4 years old. And that was the effect, and it didn't matter what party you were in or where you were from. You all knew each other, and you all got along together. And none of that is true anymore. And that is a situation that leads to the kind of partisanship that we now see in Washington, and that is such a disaster that we are faced with there. People say to me all the time, is this the most partisan time that we've ever had? And the answer to that question is no, it's not the most partisan time we've ever had. It's not the 1850s. They're not taking each other out and shooting each other. That's an improvement. And that was true. We talk about it. The Burr-Hamilton duel, but it was just the most famous. They regularly shot each other over debates in the floor of the House of Representatives and the Senate. There was a dueling ground right outside of Washington in Bladensburg. And they would call each other out for what was said on the floor of the Congress and just pull out a gun. Now, you know, and think about it with Burr Hamilton. I mean, we learn about that event in our history. But think about it. The sitting Vice President of the United States murdered his political enemy over political speech. You know, I mean, our most recent vice president had a problem with a gun, but as far as I know, it was not the problem of politics. He wasn't aiming, so it's not that bad. We're not dealing with that kind of animus, but it's bad, and part of the reason that it is bad is because of that isolation. The people do not know each other. Families don't move to Washington and get to know each other. The members come in from Tuesday to Thursday. They go to fundraisers while they're there, as well as do the business of Congress. Then they come back to the districts, and they really don't have any sense of collegiality or camaraderie, and it does lead to much more regionalism and partisanship. And actually, that's been true from the beginning. You've heard that I've written some history books, and in the early days of Washington, in fact, when there were boarding houses that all the members lived in, they did tend to live with people that they agreed with, and Albert Gallatin, who was in Congress in the beginning and then was Jefferson's Secretary of the Treasury, wrote to his wife. He said, "Without hardly any other society than ourselves, we are not likely to be either very moderate politically or to think of anything but politics." So the effect of just having them be on top of each other without any family is one that does lead to this very tense and unproductive partisanship that we see so much of today. Thomas Jefferson contributed to it because he would have dinners for the Federalists one night and the Republicans another night. I think probably because he'd say one thing in one place and one thing in another, and you know, not want to be caught on it. But while he was doing that, Dolly Madison was doing something very different. She is the person who really started the kind of business of bringing people together and making them behave in ways that were very salutary for the continuation of the Republic, because it took very little time for the kind of partisanship that we do see today to break out in the young country. And the regionalism was very fierce. And of course, it was way too young a country and way too fragile to really be able to sustain it. And so what she would do is she really set up a whole separate power base at her house on F Street when Madison was Secretary of State, and then moved it on into the executive mansion when he became president, where she would bring people together, make them break bread together, have some wine together, some cider together, and talk to each other, behave. And she really did keep the gears going and keep people speaking to each other in a way that was very, very useful. And people all had to come to her events because that was where political information got traded, and that's where you made your deals. And so they had to go there, and she was an incredible people person. So at one point, Henry Clay said to her, "Everybody loves Mrs. Madison." And she said, "Well, that's because Mrs. Madison loves everybody." Now, I have read her mail. I know that's not true. But that was the effect she had. And it really, she and the other women who came with her and after her kept that sort of spirit of comity going. But, Henry Clay is a very good example of the kind of politician that we really don't have right now. Somebody who was willing to constantly work across the aisle and create the compromises that allowed the country to keep functioning up until the Civil War. Just recently, Chris Christie, when he was in the little period where we thought he was going to be the not Romney candidate, we've had quite a few of those, he was at the Reagan Library, and he said, the way to get things done is compromise and leadership. And of course, that was something that Clay understood. And in fact, there's a wonderful book by Remini saying about the Compromise of 1850, which Clay forged, and saying basically that it kept the country together for another 10 years to before the war, and that those 10 years turned out to be quite crucial in terms of Union victory. But of course, those 10 years were unbelievably partisan times, and they did end in war. So when you see them, echoes of them today, it's very concerning. I mean, I keep saying, thank goodness we don't have an overarching moral issue like slavery. And of course, there is no issue like slavery. But something that is really cleaving the country in some fundamental way, because we do not have at the moment the measures to bring it back together if something like that would happen. It would be very, very serious given the animus that exists today. And it's odd because there isn't something that really is pulling us apart in some huge way. There isn't some, people are not riven by war or by race or by something like that, but the feelings are very high. And they're so different from the time that I grew up in, as I was saying earlier, in the 1940s and 50s in Washington, when I think that at that point we had very, very different attitudes. I had the great honor last summer of being asked to be a eulogist at Betty Ford's funeral. Mrs. Ford had asked me to do this several years ago, and then she told me exactly what to say, so it was easy. Otherwise I would have been really scared, but since she had written it for me, I was okay. But what she wanted me to talk about, the fact that the families did used to be friends, and men, and it was men for the most part, used to be friends, and that was when things did get done. And she reminded me that the last interview I had with President Ford, that he had said to me, Cokie, when I was minority leader and your father was majority leader, we would get in a cab together and go downtown to some place like the Press Club, and we'd say, okay, what are we going to argue about? And he said, now, it was a real argument. It wasn't fake. We really did have different views of the means to an end. We were highly political people. We were the leaders of our parties in the House. But then the debate would be over, and we'd get back in the cab and be best friends. And, that just simply doesn't exist anymore. We have Bill Frist from here, who's, now does wonderful work with Tom Daschle. They do all kinds of work for people around the world, but it didn't happen when they were in the Senate. And that is the big difference, is that you can do it after, George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton. Barbara Bush, who used to make really snarky remarks about Bill Clinton, says, he's now my fourth son and a fifth son, and so they can get together when they no longer have to do the business of government. But it would be awfully useful if they could get together to do the business of government. And I've thought a lot about why they were able to do it then. And I have read and written a lot of history. And I have come to believe that that period was aberrant in a way, that we have generally in our history been more partisan than not, although not quite this bad. But that period was different because it was after World War II. And there were two enormous freshman classes. There was a class of 1946 that was the big Republican class that Harry Truman ran against, and then a huge Democratic class of 1948. And they were very self-conscious veterans. They ran as the men who went, not the men who sent. And so there they were in the Congress, having all been literally to war together. I mean, many of them had been in trenches together. And of course, the whole country had gone to war. The country had lived with rationing and had a sense of shared sacrifice and all of that. So I think that there was then much more of a sense that the enemy was not the guy across the aisle. It was the dictator across the ocean. And of course, the Cold War was on, and there was much to fear. And so I think that sort of brought people together in a way that was much more convivial, but also constructive than we've seen in the decades sort of since that generation mostly retired or died out. But it is also true that the political parties themselves were very different. And that's really what we're dealing with right now. There were plenty of Democrats in Congress who voted with the Republicans, and there were plenty of Republicans who voted with the Democrats. Now there is exactly one member of either body of Congress who sometimes votes with the other party. I mean, it's really remarkable. So, on anything that is considered a partisan issue. The National Journal did a study in 2010 of the last Congress. And in looking at it, every single Senate Democrat, even the most conservative, Ben Nelson of Nebraska, had a more liberal voting record than every single Senate Republican, even including Olympia Snowe and Susan Collins of Maine. So that there was absolutely no overlap whatsoever. And those women who occasionally would walk across the aisle to vote with the Democrats, as they did on as Snowe did on the health care bill, for instance, Snowe is about to go, and so is Ben Nelson. So that it means that you have, the people who did occasionally cross, even though their total voting records remained to the left if they were Democrats and to the right if they were Republicans, they would occasionally cross the aisle to vote with each other. The people who did that are more and more and more leaving. And after this election, it will be even fewer. In the House, again, less overlap than in any other previous index. And the few people who did overlap, and when that study was done in 2010, are mostly gone after the 2010 election. There's only one left, Walter Jones of North Carolina, a Republican whose father was a Democrat, so it might give him different views. But back in 1999, more than half of the House, more than half, had records where the Democrats, where they were between the most conservative Republican and the most conservative Democrat and the most liberal Republican. But that's just gone, and the parties are voting completely differently. Lindsey Graham, the senator from South Carolina, who can be very thoughtful on these issues, says, "You are one team versus the other, and never the twain shall meet. If it's a Democratic idea, I have to be against it because it came from a Democrat, and vice versa." And Dick Gebhardt, who used to be the Democratic leader in the House, similarly says, "You're either on the blue team or the red team, and you never wander off. When we came," he said, "people voted with the other side. There was this understanding that we were there to solve problems." So what happened? Why has it become so incredibly separated? Well, I think the families, as I said earlier, I think that had something to do with it. People no longer or visit with each other and listen to each other and have ideas that they share with each other. I think the media bears a lot of the responsibility that, we tend to give our microphones to the loudest shouters. This is, of course, particularly true of cable television, but it can be true of other programs as well. The question the producers ask is, what's the argument? They don't want to hear from the sensible person or the moderate person. That's boring, not good TV. Of course, there's talk radio, and then there's the blogosphere. And all of that is just fraught with anger and upset and vituperation and name-calling, so that, that you have any ability to any ability to try to moderate that, you just get vilified by everybody on what's supposed to be your team. Another, I think, very huge part of this is the drawing of district lines. We've always had gerrymandering. We've always been able to maneuver the drawing of congressional districts to the benefit of the people who are in office. But the difference now is computers. So you can now make a congressional district where, you get every one-eyed veteran in the district into your voting block, whatever it is that you think is going to work for you. So these are these incredibly safe districts where there are no people of the other party in the district. And the only way you can get into trouble is to not be pure enough for the people in your district who are true believers. So that means, you have to be ultra-conservative if you're a Republican and ultra-liberal if you're a Democrat to run in those kinds of districts. I had an interesting experience in the last year of the Bush presidency, where I got this call out of the blue from the White House press secretary, Dana Perino. And, I don't cover the White House. I didn't know Dana Perino. I'd seen her on TV. That was about it. And so I was very surprised to get this call. And she said, Cokie, the president wants to know when the Pope comes to town, if you would like to ride with him in the limousine out to Andrews Air Force Base when he goes to meet the Pope. And I said, okay, I'll see if I can clear my schedule and do that. And the reason he wanted me to go with him was because my mother had been, as I said earlier, the ambassador to the Vatican, so I could talk Pope. And actually, it was really quite wonderful when my mother became ambassador, because we were very excited. She was 81 years old. She was taking this new job in this new country, and we would all get to go to Italy all the time and all of that. And we thought it was this great capstone to a career in public service where she could serve both her country and her church. And then what happened in this country happened, and my mother found herself representing Bill Clinton to the Pope. Now, think of it. It was the toughest job in the diplomatic service. But if anybody could do it, Mama could, but it wasn't easy. She then went back home to Bourbon Street, where her house was, right smack dab in the middle of all the honky-tonk on Bourbon Street. When my children were small, we'd walk past the strippers and the other neighbors, and I'd say, through the woods and over the hills to grandmother's house we go. But, and then she moved from Bourbon Street to the Vatican, and I teased her that the costumes hadn't changed. It was still guys in dresses. But at any rate, because of this relationship, the president asked me to go with him, and it was fascinating. He wanted to talk to me about how he was breaking precedent to go, because normally a head of state comes to the White House and the president greets him there, but he was breaking precedent to go out to Andrews to show his respect for the Pope and for the church. And he started talking about the important things that the church was doing in America, and he talked particularly about the issue of immigration. And I said, well, you know, what about that? Why haven't you been able to move that? And he said, my party absolutely will not move on this issue because of the way the district lines are drawn. Because people are so afraid that if they do anything, that they will get attacked from the right on the issue. So I cannot move a piece of comprehensive legislation. And of course, he turned out to be right. I mean, in that election, you saw several people lose on that issue, Republicans, or on other issues where they were cooperating with Democrats. And Bob Bennett of Utah, one of the most conservative members of the Senate, got beaten in the primary in a convention in Utah because he wasn't pure enough. And John McCain in that same election was run against in 2010 from the right. And so his whole demeanor in the Senate then changes when he comes back. You've seen it right now in the Senate with Orrin Hatch and with Dick Lugar. You know, long-time conservative members of the Senate being challenged as not being conservative enough, not being pure enough. So it means they can't move and talk to anybody to try to affect legislation, which in both cases they were past masters at. But it can't be done. And the same thing's true on the Democratic side. You saw it in that last election with Blanche Lincoln in Arkansas, who managed to survive her primary, but if she was so weakened by it, being attacked from the left, that she then lost the general election. Joe Lieberman in Connecticut finally running as an independent because he was defeated from the left. So it's just the way that the House districts are drawn, and then the members of the House come to the Senate, and the whole body politic, the whole atmosphere in the body politic is that you just have to be the purest of the pure for your party, but not somebody who is accomplishing something for the country. And also there's the permanent campaign that goes on, so that there's never a moment of sort of saying, okay, that's behind me and now I can get on with the business of governing, because the campaign goes on and on. The electorate has also changed. Your senator, Lamar Alexander, someone who's always worked across party lines, when he recently decided not to run for the leadership in the Senate, he said he thought he could be more effective outside of the leadership because he would be able to work with the other side. He said, I'm quoting here, "I'm not interested in bipartisanship as a goal. I'm interested in it as a tactic to solve problems." Well, then we all started sort of looking at his career and seeing, what had changed while he had been in politics. When he first ran for governor in 1979, here's how the parties looked. Democrats identified themselves as 31% conservative, 21% liberal, and the rest moderates. Now, it's 18% conservative, 38% liberal. The Republicans in 1979 called themselves 42% conservative, 15% liberal, 35% moderate. Now it's 63% conservative, 6% liberal, 28% moderate. So that you have a change in the parties as well as in the representatives. And it's the reason that more and more people are saying that they are independent or unaffiliated, because they don't like the extremism of the parties. They liked the parties better when you had more of a mix. ABC recent polls showed more independents than either party, and that's been holding true now for a couple of years. There was a big Democratic uptick right after the 2008 election, but it went down again. And it's part of the reason that the presidential campaign has been so, schizophrenic, because you have this, particularly with Mitt Romney, trying to thread this needle of appealing to the people who have to vote for, he has to appeal to in the primaries, while trying not to burn his bridges going into the general election, where the independent vote is the vote that counts. Really, the elections are only decided by about 6% of the people in the middle. And they're the ones, who show up and decide. And if they show up, they make the difference. But this polarization is not just driving people out of political parties. It's also driving them away from trust in any institutions. The congressional approval is in the basement. I mean, depending on the polls you look at, it's in single digits. It's down to sort of close friends and family that approve of Congress. And John McCain said recently, he says, I hear that, that there's 10% congressional approval rating. Those people don't show up at my town meetings, that 10%. But there's also historic negativity, to quote Gallup, about government. 81% of the people say they're dissatisfied with the way the country is governed. That's 9 points higher than previous high in the Bush administration, but almost twice as high as the norm. And the same thing's true about other institutions. Only 19% say they trust big business, 23% banks. People saying the media is biased has gone up 20 percentage points since 1985. And the trouble with that, the trouble with the lack of confidence in government, is that it feeds on itself. If you don't have faith in any institutions to fix anything, then it becomes harder for those institutions to do anything. And they can't do something that's temporarily unpopular for the long-term good, and then think that they will live to see another day. So they then appear ineffectual, because in fact they are, and that drives up the lack of trust. And so we keep looking around and saying, how do we fix this? We need, to get something done, particularly at times when we're looking at the kinds of deficit situation we're in, the wars we're in, all of that. And it does come back to those things that Chris Christie said, leadership and compromise. And then the question is, how do we get that? Well, one answer, actually, is to elect more women. And we have learned that this is the, no, it's true, it's the last bastion of bipartisanship in the Senate, is the women in the Senate. Barbara Mikulski, who this week became the longest serving woman in Congress, likes to pull herself up to her full 4'11" and say, talk about the women of the Senate. And now there are 17, and they have regular dinners where they get together because they find that that's where they can get things done, that they can sit down and meet with each other and actually accomplish something. I think they also like to be in a testosterone-free zone, but actually there's a very funny story that Nancy Pelosi tells in her book, where she and a couple of other female members of Congress went out to dinner regularly with a bunch of the male members of Congress who all of their families were away. And she said the guys would dominate the conversation, and they would kind of put up with us if we'd say something here and there, but not much. And she said, and then one night the whole conversation turned to the subject of childbirth. And they're telling these gory stories, and she says, among the three of us, the women, we had given birth to 11 children. And she said, we all thought, this is the moment. They're actually going to ask us, or maybe see if we'd like to change the subject. And no, they absolutely continued to ignore them. And when the women called them on it, the men said, that's not true. We did talk to you. But she then says, I didn't come to Congress to change the attitudes of men. I came to change the policies of our country. And that is what the women find that they do when they get together, that they, particularly on issues relating to women and children and families, that they can come together in a bipartisan fashion and change the policies of the country. My mother, when she went to Congress, and at that point there were only 16 women in Congress, my father's plane had been lost and never found, and she found that she had the experience of a great many women, which was that not only did she lose her husband, but she lost her credit. And she got to Congress, and she was on the Banking and Currency Committee, a good place to fix this. And as she tells the story, they were writing a bill, marking up a bill that ended discrimination in lending, and it said on the basis of race, religion, or national origin. And she says she went into a back room and wrote in longhand, or sex or marital status, and Xeroxed it and brought it in and said to her colleagues in just an oh-so-sweet Southern way, you know, I'm sure this was just an omission on the part of my colleagues. And that's how we got equal credit. But it is something that has happened on issue after issue, where women not only bring their own experiences to the table, but the experiences of women all over the country that come to them and tell them. Today, on the floor of the House, today, they were debating the reauthorization of the Violence Against Women Act, and one of the women members, Gwen Moore, stood up and talked about the violence that was perpetrated against her as a child with repeated assaults, and then the fact that she had been raped. Now, that is a different experience, and women bring that along with the problems with pensions and health care and child care, and there is just example after example where that has been true. And it is in both parties. In fact, in the big welfare reform bill in the Clinton administration, it was the Republican women in the House who insisted that child support enforcement be included in the bill because the way it was is it stopped at a state line, and so you could never get child support. But whether it's funding for breast cancer research or family and medical leave, again, totally bipartisan from the women in the Congress, they organize across party lines and get these things done. In fact, just the other night, they had the 35th anniversary of the formation of the Congressional Caucus on Women's Issues, celebrating that fact that they have been doing that for so long. The data that we have on it, for a long time we never had enough women in the national legislature to be able to measure it, but we did in state legislatures, and the data shows, and obviously there are exceptions. There is Michelle Bachmann and Maxine Waters, you know, but by and large, women in legislative bodies are more bipartisan, more pragmatic, and less ideological than men are. So we now have 17 senators, 73 House members, 6 cabinet and cabinet-level women, 3 Supreme Court justices, 6 governors, 11 lieutenant governors. It's becoming women's work, and about 23% of the state legislatures. Now, that number is a little disturbing to me because for a long time we had a steady increase from about 1979 to 93. We saw it going up just steadily, so it went from 10% to 20% in that period of time. But it's hovered around 22% ever since then. We're seeing this year 2 of the governors, the 2 who are Democrats in Washington and North Carolina, not running again. 2 senators, the 2 who are Republicans, Olympia Snowe and Kay Hutchison, are not running again. But Republicans have a shot in New Mexico Senate race, Hawaii Senate race, where also a Democratic woman has a shot, and Democrats in Massachusetts, Nevada, maybe North Dakota, maybe Wisconsin. And the House, there would be 67 incumbents running again. 1 lost a primary. But there's 71 women running in 39 districts that have open seats. So there will be a pickup then in the House of Representatives. But the problem is it's hard to get people to run. It's very hard to get people to run. And part of the reason is money. It's harder for women to raise money than it is for men still, and they find it distasteful. Part of the reason for the national legislature is getting people to come back and forth to Washington and the district. That's disruptive for all families, but women find it particularly disruptive. For a long time, Maryland had the most number of women in Congress, and I was interviewing a PhD candidate for a fellowship, and she had done her thesis on why Maryland was so foresightful, having all of these women, and the answer turned out to be because it was close. It really was, so they could get home and cook dinner, and so that is a problem. But it is also that the atmosphere is so ugly. This hostility, this vituperation, this partisanship that I've been talking about does keep people, particularly women, from wanting to run. But then, of course, it becomes, again, a self-perpetuating situation, because if fewer women run, you do have a more ugly situation, and then that leads to fewer women running. You know, we've just gotten through this situation where you saw that Georgetown law student testifying on the contraceptive guidelines in Congress, and it got, as you know, very, very nasty. The president of Georgetown, in response to all of the hoo-ha over it, issued this very, very thoughtful statement where he said, whether you agreed with her or not, she had participated respectfully in the public square. And then he went on to say something that I think we should all just sort of needlepoint and put on our walls, because he says, in an earlier time, St. Augustine captured the sense of what is required in civil discourse. Quote, "Let us on both sides lay aside all arrogance. Let us not on either side claim that we have already discovered the truth. Let us seek it together as something which is known to neither of us. For then only may we seek it lovingly and tranquilly, if there be no bold presumption that it is already discovered and possessed." And to that I say, amen. So thank you very much. I would be delighted to take your questions. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Good evening. I'm Gene Policinski of the First Amendment Center here at Vanderbilt, and my simple task is to point out that there are microphones at the top of the side aisles, and that if you need a microphone, which you should have to ask a question, and you're not able to get to those, please raise your hand and one will be brought to you. And with that, again, Ms. Roberts.
Okay, thank you. Questions? And if we could turn the house lights up and these spotlights down so I could see people, that would be nice. There we go. You're a very nice-looking crowd. Okay, questions? Go ahead. Are you at a microphone? What's happening there?
I think we have a question there.
I can't tell.
Cokie, my question was, is, can you comment on the past summer's debt ceiling debate, which I found extremely discouraging and almost a lack of patriotism? But I'd be curious to know what your thought is on, when you say the business of government, there's going to be a big issue out there, and in my mind it's the debt ceiling, and at some point the rubber's going to meet the road where the country can't function because its finances are a mess.
Well, I mean,
and there but for Greece is the United States.
Well, no, it's not that bad. I lived in Greece, trust me on this one. But it's exactly what I was. Please, thank you. I feel like I'm talking to God. It's exactly what I was saying earlier. I mean, the debt ceiling fight was a perfect illustration of the inability to cross party lines and to come together over something where everybody knows what you have to do. And I mean, there are no mysteries here. It's just a question of will. And I think that the view basically at the moment is that we have to live through this election, and that the election is the place to take this fundamental question about the role of government, which is what we are talking about, and let the electorate hash it out, and then see where we are. The problem with that, of course, is that we lose a lot in the process. Right now, right this second, they're about to not extend a transportation bill that's going to run out on Sunday, and we're going to lose $1 billion a day as a result of it. I mean, how does that make sense? You know, but the inability to say this is crazy and just fix it is so high, and it's for all the reasons that I've just cited. So I think we'll just have to see what happens in this election, but the only other real answer, other than getting more women in there, is for the voters to basically say, we're sick of this. I mean, politicians do respond to voters. That's what they're doing here. They're just responding to the voters they're hearing from. But if anybody, starts punishing people for not compromising, then you'll have a completely different response out of the Congress. But right now, they're getting punished if they do compromise.
First of all, it is such an honor to have you here
Well, that's
and
very kind of
to
you. Thank you. Thank you.
hear you speak. I've been influenced by you by listening to you for more decades than probably either you or I was going to say either you or I want to acknowledge. So I found your remarks very plausible, and the importance of women in our government to be especially important. So the question I want to ask moves in a somewhat different direction and is complex. So I'd like to know just the beginnings of your thinking about this. When I think about the 1950s, when I was a child, maybe even a teenager at that point, I don't know, I don't remember. I think of being in New York and having Eisenhower as my governor, who developed the public, university system, et cetera, et cetera. He was the typical Republican.
You had Rockefeller as your governor. Yeah.
Rockefeller, not Eisenhower,
right,
Rockefeller,
right,
I'm sorry.
sorry.
And you had Rockefeller Republicans, right?
Right.
And on the other side, you had poor people's movements and welfare reform and Democrats to the left of Ted Kennedy, or certainly
But you
there.
also had Democrats like Jim Eastland in Mississippi.
Right,
So,
but the nature of the public discourse, what was considered to the left and to the right, were fundamentally different then than they are today at the same time that you find this heightened partisanship.
I'm not sure I understand the question.
What happened? In other words, how did we move at the same time that we polarized so? The nature of our discourse has moved markedly, even among Democrats, rightward.
Oh, okay. Actually, that's true when you look at the data. I didn't think it was true, but it is. I think it's, that the country goes in moods, and I think that there was a sense that that things had swung too far, and that there was a swinging back. And I think that you do see that both parties are somewhat more conservative than they were. That's not, the Democrats is more complicated because of the Southern Democrats. But so I guess that's not true. It's not true that Democrats are more conservative than what they were. It's that they currently in Congress are voting more conservatively than they did, but say in the 70s, but not the 50s. So that is true, but I do think it's just one of those pendulum swings that you have, in our politics, and you have them all the time. You see them generationally. Yeah.
Yes, Ms. Roberts, thank you so much for being here tonight. Ever since I was able to vote when I was 18, I thought I'll try to make the system work. Once a year, I wrote to my congressman and my 2 senators and told them what I thought
Good
they
for
need to
you.
focus on. And sometimes I got no response.
That's not
and
good.
One time, I remember, I will name names on this one, it's true. Senator Frist sent me, his office, I'm sure he didn't read it, sent me a form letter about the Farm Bills Act. And I had not written anything about farmers in my letter. But anyhow, this past year, I've written over 4 letters, and I've always heard from someone that worked for a congressman, handwritten letters are top priority. So I always handwrite my letters, and because of the anthrax scare years ago, I've tried to mail them, fax them, and if I get a response, it's just blah, blah, blah. And so with your insider knowledge, what does it take to get them to realize that they're not up there to play Dungeons and Dragons, they're there to serve the people of the United States of America?
Well, they're not playing Dungeons and Dragons. They actually are working, but the problem is that they're working to try to figure out ways to stop the other guy. And that's always been true to some degree, but it is, as I said earlier, much truer now. I'm surprised that you have had that kind of response, because usually congressional offices are very good about the mail, but maybe they're just so swamped at the moment and understaffed that that's the problem. But I think that, usually members of Congress are very available. I mean, there are town meetings, they have office hours, I always joke that it's not that they're inaccessible. You can't get rid of them half the time. They're at every firehouse opening and bar mitzvah and first communion and whatever. So I think if you go and personally show up, either at an office or where somebody is holding an event, that you would be able to talk to that person. I would be very surprised if that were not the case.
Going back to the question of contraceptive and the panels that they brought out, did you hear them reconcile any way that there wasn't any women on the first panel
I think it just
birth control?
didn't occur to them.
But isn't that appalling? This was no different than the 70s for me.
Well, I mean, it is. I really think that's the case. I think they just didn't. It didn't cross their minds, and that happens, all the time. I mean, don't you find it when men? When I'm on television with men, they just wait for my lips to stop moving. They don't hear what I say. It's. My expectations aren't very high, I guess, but the one thing we have going for us, ladies, is demography. There just aren't any of them, and white men over 30, 23% of the population. So.
I've been watching Washington for a long time, and I've listened to you for a long time, and I've never seen it worse. And when you say there are swings, I don't know where it swung from to get this bad. And it makes me wonder if the empire is in decline.
Well, different people think it's in decline for different reasons. I mean, again, where you stand sort of depends on where you sit. That some of our citizens feel strongly that we're in decline because we're talking about things like gay marriage, and other of our citizens think we're in decline because we're talking about things like contraceptives being a question. So it really is a personal perception. And I think that I actually don't think that we're in decline at all. I come on a campus like this, and I see these fabulous young people, and I have great hopes for our future. I go to a naturalization ceremony, and I'm in tears the whole time. Here are all these wonderful, brave, hard-working citizens of every imaginable country in the world who have come to this country because they believe in the promise of America, and they will make it happen. It's our great strength is that we're constantly renewing ourselves with people coming in and helping us renew ourselves and rekindle the American experiment. So I do not feel that we are in some terrible place. I think that we need to think about what our institutions are up to and to hold the people who are in our institutions accountable. But that doesn't mean being horrible to them. It means, you know, saying here's what I strongly believe is your constituent or your stakeholder or your customer, and here's what I think you should be doing. And I think that you know, that is an appropriate role for all of us in an open society. But I don't see the need to get into a sort of a downward, depressed view about it, because then you really become paralyzed, and that becomes really a cop-out in a way. And I think that is not a useful citizenry. Yeah.
Hi, Ms. Roberts. It's nice to finally see you in person.
Thank you.
So I'm thinking about a career in science and health policy. And in light of the discussion today and the things that I've been hearing on the news, I was wondering if you could actually tell me about the future viability of my chosen career.
Oh, are you kidding? You're in Growth City. Look around you at these medical buildings.
Right. I'm skeptical, I suppose, of the fact that, well, I guess what my question is, how much do the policymakers actually pay attention to the science and the studies that are being done? How much are they listening to, say, the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, the RAND Corporation, studies done by the National Academies of Science?
Well, actually, when it comes to sitting down and writing legislation, a lot of those studies are paid a great deal of attention to. Because, you know, the legislation is written by staffers in committees who are highly expert. Now, they might, you know, you might find somebody who finds a study that's on the other side, but by and large, the organizations like the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, the Kaiser Family Foundation, whose board I'm on, and Bill Frist is on, you know, are very much listened to. Now, it's very interesting in the Supreme Court arguments right now. The data from Kaiser Family Foundation is being used by everybody, you know, because it's very solid information, but people are using it to support their arguments on both sides. So, you know, you can take data and use it, but the basic question of do people pay attention to those institutions, the answer is yes.
You have no idea how difficult it is for a free speech advocate to say this, but we have come probably to our last question. Let me, before that question comes, remind you that there will be a reception and book signing following this session in the lobby. But the frantic waving in the schedule and the clock requires us to go to our last question.
Okay.
Cokie, can you give us your insider perception about where the healthcare debate is going and the Supreme Court proceedings?
Well, you know, everybody's, I mean, you know, I love watching people report on the Supreme Court because the truth is nobody has a clue. I mean, we know how, you know, 7 of the 6 certainly, but probably 7 of the justices are going to vote. But from the questioning, the reporting is that it sounds like the justices are going to say that the individual mandate is unconstitutional and that they're then trying to figure out what happens after that. And the White House is saying we don't have a plan B. Now, whether that is designed to try to pressure people, you know, is a question. It seems to me they probably do have a plan B. But if I had to put money on it, I would guess that they would say that the mandate is unconstitutional, but the law does not fall. And then you have to figure out what on earth to do, and that's going to be very tough. You know, but it's doable. It is more doable at a national level than it is in a state. So what's happened in the states? that have tried to do health care reform without a mandate, which is pretty much every state but Massachusetts where it's working fine, is that the premiums just went sky high because people who didn't have pre-existing conditions and all of that could get into the pool. And so it broke the states. And so they started, putting in restrictions again. But there's a reason to believe that on a national level, particularly with subsidies, which this legislation does have, that you would be able to create a big enough pool that you might be able to do it without an individual mandate. We just don't know. And so the question is, if you start doing state exchanges and people get into competition with each other, can you then get to that point where you have a low enough premium and still enough people are covered, and enough sick people are covered, and we really do not know the answer to that question. But I think that is where we're likely to be headed. If the decision of the court is that the mandate is unconstitutional. I think it's exactly that, is trying to figure out how to continue to cover people who are not currently covered without raising the premium so high that they're unaffordable. So,
again, thank you for...
Thank you very, very much. It's great to be with you. Thank you. Thank you very much.